A hidden grave, a body no one ever found, and a fight in the unseen world that almost nobody knows even happened. The Bible says that after Moses died, there was a dispute over his body, and it wasn't between men. It was between Michael the archangel and the devil. And Michael didn't argue with shouting or insults. He spoke one sentence. So let me ask you honestly, what did Satan want to do with a dead body? Because Moses wasn't just any leader. He saw the sea split open. He heard God on Sinai, and he carried a rebellious people for 40 years. And in the end, something even stranger happens. Scripture says God himself buried him, and to this day no one knows where the grave is. Deuteronomy 34, 5-6. No headstone, no pilgrimage, no holy site, just silence. And when God hides something like that, it's because there was danger. So the questions start to press in. Why would God hide the grave of the most famous man in Israel? What was he protecting the people from? And even more unsettling, how did the devil know where the body was? What was he planning to do with it? Turn Moses into an idol? Use that body as a spiritual weapon to trap the faith of generations, or stain the memory of God's servant through accusation? And here's the detail that changes everything. If there was a dispute, it means the battle didn't end when Moses closed his eyes. It continued in the invisible world. And that's the part almost nobody tells you. What if you want to understand why God didn't allow Moses' body to become a relic? Why the staff disappears from the spotlight? And why God's holiness matters more than the fame of any man? Stay with me to the end, because the answer is terrifying. And when it finally shows up, you'll realize God wasn't hiding a grave. He was protecting faith. If this story has already put you on alert, or comment, God protects what is holy. And stay with me, because the truth behind this dispute is only revealed at the end. Join us as we dive into one of the most hidden mysteries in Scripture, where Moses, the man who saw the sea split open, also lived through the pain of the wilderness, the betrayal of his own people, and the crushing weight of leading when no one else could take it anymore. Get ready to see how God turns a broken man into a deliverer, and how, in the end, even the body of that servant became part of an unseen battle. Because here, the impossible isn't only about miracles, it's about protection, and yet it's about holiness, and it's a promise that reveals itself when everything feels silent. Moses grew up inside a palace, but he never forgot he wasn't Egyptian. He knew his blood was Hebrew. He knew his people groaned under whips. One day, already grown, he went out to look at the forced labor of his brothers, just as it is written in the book of Exodus, chapter 2, verse 11. There he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. The scene wasn't new. The suffering was daily. But in that moment, something burned inside him. He looked one way, then the other. No one saw. And so he struck the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day, when he tried to break up a fight between two Hebrews, he heard words that cut through his chest like a blade. "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Exodus 2:14. The secret had been exposed. Fear took over. Pharaoh heard what had happened and wanted to kill him. Moses ran. The prince became a fugitive. Man raised among gold and marble began to walk alone through the wilderness. Guilt, shame, and failure became his companions. In the wilderness of Midian, far from Egypt, Moses left behind his name, his position, and his dreams. He became a shepherd in the house of Jethro. The one trained in the finest school of Egypt now learned to lead animals through the silence of the mountains. The wilderness is a place that strips away what's extra and shows us who we really are, when there are no applause lines, no audience, only sand, wind, and time. Years passed. The impulsive man grew quieter. The fighter became a shepherd. Maybe he thought his story had ended there, between dust and silence. Maybe he said to himself, "I ruined everything." But God had not forgotten him. One day, while tending the flock, he led the sheep to Mount Horeb, as it is written in the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verse 1. And there he saw something he had never seen before, and a bush was burning with fire, yet it was not consumed. The fire blazed, but the plant remained whole. Moses moved closer to see this great sight. Then he heard his name called from the middle of the fire. "Moses, Moses," he answered. "Here I am." The voice said, "Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Exodus 3:4-5. The man who felt like a failure was standing before the living God, and the fugitive was being called by the Creator of heaven and earth. God revealed that he had heard the cry of his people in Egypt, and that he would come down to deliver them. Then he said something that changed everything. "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Exodus 3:10. Moses felt the weight of that responsibility. He looked at himself and saw only weakness. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Exodus 3:11. The question wasn't arrogance. It was fear. It was insecurity. God answered with simple certainty, "I will be with you." Exodus 3:12. It wasn't about Moses' ability, it was about God's presence. Still, Moses hesitated. In chapter 4 of Exodus, he says, "They will not believe me." And God asks him a question that echoes through the centuries. "What is that in your hand?" Exodus 4:2. When Moses answered, "A staff." It was only a piece of wood, something ordinary, simple, used to guide sheep. Nothing impressive, nothing glorious. God commanded, "Throw it on the ground." He threw it down. The staff became a serpent. Moses ran from it. God said, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." When he touched it, it became a staff again. Exodus 4:3-4. The simple object became a sign of the power of God. Even after that miracle, Moses tried to pull back again. "O Lord, I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Exodus 4:10. He kept staring at his limitations. God answered firmly, "Who has made man's mouth? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth." Exodus 4:11-12. The calling didn't depend on Moses being perfect. It depended on God being faithful. In the end, the Lord said to him, "Take this staff in your hand, with which you shall do the signs." Exodus 4:17. That piece of wood now carried a mission, but something deeper was happening. God had chosen the staff. Yet the man's heart was still being worked on. The instrument was ready. The man was still learning to trust. Moses left that encounter different. He was no longer just a shepherd, but he still wasn't the confident deliverer people imagine. He was a man in process. A broken man, but called. An insecure man, but accompanied. A man with a staff in his hand and a promise in his heart. And that is how the journey begins. And if the staff became a sign, who controls that sign? The staff was chosen, but the man's heart still wasn't. The man who came down from the mountain with a staff in his hand now had to prove whether he truly trusted the promise he had heard. The calling was clear. God's presence was guaranteed. And yet fear still walked beside him. Going back to Egypt meant going back to the place where he had failed. Back to Pharaoh's face. Back to the memories he had tried to bury in the sand. When he asked Jethro for permission, he kept it simple. "Let me go back to my brothers in Egypt and to see whether they are still alive." Exodus 4:18. But deep down he knew he wasn't returning for a visit. He was returning for a confrontation. Along the way, holding the staff, he may have stared at it in silence. It wasn't heavy. It was only wood. But now, it carried meaning. God had said, "Take this staff in your hand, so you can perform signs with it." Exodus 4:17. The object was ready. The man was still learning. When he arrived in Egypt, he met Aaron. But they embraced like brothers who knew they were stepping into a war bigger than both of them. Aaron asked, "Are you ready?" Moses answered honestly, "No, but he is with me." They gathered the elders of Israel. Aaron spoke the words the Lord had given. Moses performed the signs before them. The staff became a serpent. His hand became leprous and was restored. The text says the people believed. Exodus 4:31. An older man came closer, and his eyes filled with tears. "Did God really see our suffering?" Moses replied, "He saw it. He heard it. He came down to set us free." They bowed and worshipped. Hope filled the air. After years of slavery, the word freedom seemed possible again. But hope had not yet felt the weight of a real confrontation. Moses and Aaron went in before Pharaoh and declared, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, 'Let my people go.'" Exodus 5:1. Pharaoh didn't rise. He didn't show fear, and he only answered coldly, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord." Those words weren't just rejection, they were a challenge. The throne was mocking heaven. Then Pharaoh ordered the labor to be doubled. No straw, no rest. Same production, more suffering. A foreman shouted at the Hebrews, "You want to worship? Then work harder." The shouting echoed across the fields. The whip cracked through the air. The burden grew heavier on the people's shoulders. But the officers of Israel went to complain to Pharaoh. They found no mercy, and when they came out, they met Moses. Hope turned into accusation. "May the Lord judge you," they said. "You have made a stink in Pharaoh's eyes." Exodus 5:21. Those words hurt more than any whip. Moses didn't argue. He didn't raise the staff. He performed no sign at all. He turned to God. Alone, he cried out, "Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why did you send me? Ever since I spoke in your name, and the suffering has only increased." Exodus 5:22-23. That was the real conflict. It wasn't only Pharaoh. It was the crisis between promise and reality, between God's word and the waiting. God had called. Moses had obeyed. The people had believed. And now everyone was under pressure. Faith that is born in a miracle still has to survive resistance. Hope is born, and soon it becomes rebellion. The staff is in the right hands, but standing before the wrong man. The tension rose day after day. The people were exhausted. Pharaoh was hardening his heart, and Moses had to return to the palace once again. God had been clear. When Pharaoh says to you, "Perform a miracle," you shall say to Aaron, "Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh." Exodus 7:8-9. This was no longer just a request for freedom. It was a direct confrontation between human authority and divine authority. The throne room was full. Guards, advisors, and priests watched closely, and Pharaoh sat there, confident in his power. Moses and Aaron stepped in. The silence was heavy. Pharaoh looked at them with contempt. "You're back? Do you think words scare me?" Moses took a slow breath. He didn't answer with an argument. He simply signaled to Aaron. Aaron held the staff. His eyes met Moses for a moment. It was more than a gesture. It was obedience. He threw the staff down before Pharaoh and before his servants. The text says the staff became a serpent, Exodus 7:10. And a murmur ran through the room. A few men stepped back, but Pharaoh didn't move. Instead, he called for his wise men and his sorcerers. "Show them that Egypt has power too." The magicians threw their staffs to the ground. They also became serpents. The air filled with tension. To human eyes, it looked like a draw. The supernatural was right there in front of them. But which power was real? Moses felt his heart race. For a moment he may have thought, "And now?" But then something happened, and the serpent that came from Aaron's staff moved forward and swallowed the serpents of the magicians, Exodus 7:12. There was no long struggle, no extended spectacle, just supremacy. One of Pharaoh's advisors whispered, "That's not normal." Another snapped back. "It's just a trick." Pharaoh stood up slowly. He stared at the floor, where only one staff remained, intact. The sign was undeniable, and yet the text says something deeper. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Exodus 7:13. The throne had been challenged. Heaven's power had touched earth. And still, pride chose to stand its ground. Moses realized this was only the beginning. One demonstration wouldn't break Egypt's arrogance. It would take a series of confrontations. Every sign would increase the pressure. Every refusal would make the path more costly. As they left the palace, Aaron spoke in a low voice. He saw it, but he knows it isn't ordinary. Moses replied, "Seeing isn't the same as bowing." This battle wasn't only political, it was spiritual. It wasn't only about freeing a people. It was about revealing who the Lord truly is. And Moses understood something in that moment. The staff wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to expose the limits of human power, to expose the fragility of pride, to expose a hardened heart. The confrontation had begun, and it was going to cost dearly. When heaven's power touches earth, human pride becomes a danger. Before we continue, I want to ask you for a simple support. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like. That helps us keep bringing deep stories like Moses, a man who carried an entire people on his shoulders, witnessed miracles no one can explain, and still had to learn in the wilderness that real faith doesn't live on signs alone. Now, let's keep going. Because what comes next isn't only about plagues, an open sea, and manna from heaven. It's about betrayal, pressure, and a test that will break the pride of a throne and prepare the way for the final secret that almost no one knows. Pharaoh's hard heart opened the way for something greater. God had already told Moses that he would multiply his signs in Egypt, Exodus 7:3. It wasn't only to punish, it was to reveal. The Nile, the source of life and Egypt's national pride, would be the first to be touched. Moses and Aaron went again to the river. In Pharaoh's presence, Aaron stretched out the staff over the waters, just as the Lord commanded. Exodus 7:20. The river turned to blood. Fish died. The stench spread through the land. All Egypt watched its lifeline become corruption. An Egyptian shouted, "What is happening to our river?" A priest muttered under his breath, "Our gods aren't answering." Even so, the magicians imitated the sign, and Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He turned his back and walked into his palace. With each new plague, frogs, gnats, flies, the chaos intensified. And the text repeats a sentence like a hammer striking the same nail. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Exodus 8:15. The land of Egypt became a stage for unrelenting confrontation. Livestock died. Boils covered bodies. The sky poured down hail with fire mixed in it. The Egyptian people began to fear. Even some of Pharaoh's own servants started to whisper, "How long can we endure this?" In the middle of judgment, something became clear. Yet God was making a distinction between Egypt and Israel. In the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, there was no plague like the ones striking the rest of the country. Exodus 8:22. When darkness covered Egypt for 3 days, darkness so thick it could be felt, Exodus 10:21. The children of Israel still had light in their homes, Exodus 10:23. It was separation. It was protection. It was a demonstration of sovereignty. At times, Pharaoh called for Moses in a hurry. "Pray to the Lord for me, and I will let you go." But when relief came, he changed his mind again. His remorse was shallow. Pride spoke louder. Moses began to understand that this struggle wasn't only political, it was spiritual. God was judging the gods of Egypt, Exodus 12:12. Every plague shattered a false security. Then came the most terrifying announcement. God told Moses that he would pass through Egypt, and every firstborn would die that night. Exodus 11:4-5. Silence fell. This was the final blow, when Moses spoke to Pharaoh with steady firmness. At midnight, the Lord will go out through the midst of Egypt. Preparation began among the Hebrews. A lamb was chosen. Its blood was placed on the doorposts. Exodus 12:7. God declared, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." Exodus 12:13. It was judgment and deliverance at the same time. That night, a cry rose up across Egypt like never before. Exodus 12:30. Houses wept. Pharaoh himself lost his firstborn. But he called Moses and Aaron in the dark hours, desperate. "Get up, leave my people, go and serve the Lord." The impossible was happening. The throne that had laughed was now pleading. The people began to prepare. The dough had not even risen. There was no time. Deliverance stood at the door. But when judgment ends, pride doesn't always die with it. The way out was coming. But the pursuer would not give up. Deliverance has begun, and the greatest fear is still behind them. The people left Egypt in a hurry. They carried unleavened dough, hurried belongings, and hearts divided between relief and fear. By day, a pillar of cloud guided them. By night, a pillar of fire lit their way. Exodus 13:21-22. It was a clear sign of God's presence. But behind them, something began to move. When Pharaoh realized Israel had truly left, his heart changed again. "Why have we done this, letting Israel go and no longer serve us?" Exodus 14:5. Wounded pride turned into pursuit, and he prepared his chariots, gathered his horsemen, and went after them with all the power of Egypt. Exodus 14:6-7. Dust rose on the horizon. The sound of hooves cut through the air. The Hebrews looked up and saw the army drawing near. The text says they were terrified. Exodus 14:10. The sea was in front of them. The enemy was behind them. There was no visible way out. So they cried out. But it wasn't a cry of faith. It was accusation. And some shouted at Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die in the wilderness?" Exodus 14:11. Another added, "Didn't we tell you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone so we can serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve them than to die here." Fear speaks loudest when pressure tightens. The memory of slavery suddenly felt less terrifying than the threat right in front of them. Moses looked at the people, heard the accusations, and felt the weight of responsibility press down on him. But he answered firmly, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Exodus 14:13. And he added, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." Exodus 14:14. While the people trembled, God spoke to Moses. "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. And you, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and then divide it." Exodus 14:15-16. This was the decisive moment. Moses raised the staff. An east wind blew strongly all night long. The waters began to split. The sea opened, forming walls on the right and on the left. The ground became dry. Exodus 14:21. The impossible gave way to a divine command. The people crossed. Every step was a miracle. Every breath carried tension. On the other side, the Egyptians rushed in after them, but in the middle of the night, and the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. Exodus 14:24. The wheels of their chariots began to clog and drag. An Egyptian soldier cried out, "Run! The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Exodus 14:25. Then God said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea." He stretched it out. The waters returned to their place. The sea covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all of Pharaoh's army. Exodus 14:28. And not one of them remained. On the other side, Israel saw the great power of the Lord. Exodus 14:31. Fear turned into reverence. The people began to sing. Moses and the children of Israel lifted a song. "The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation." Exodus 15:2. There was celebration. There was dancing. There was relief. But the human heart learns slowly. The very people who sang about deliverance still carried insecurity inside them. The sea closed behind them as Egypt was swallowed. But the work of transformation had only just begun. After the miracle comes the wilderness. The sea closed, but is their faith open or shut? The celebration by the sea was still echoing in their minds when reality began to tighten its grip. After the song of victory, Moses led the people into the wilderness of Shur. Exodus 15:22. They walked for 3 days without finding water. The heat was brutal. Children cried. Animals weakened. The joy of deliverance began to give way to anxious dread. One man muttered to another, "We were singing just a few days ago, and now look at us." A woman held her child close and asked, "Where is the God who opened the sea?" When they finally found water, they ran to it. But the moment they tasted it, they realized it was bitter. That is why the place was called Marah, Exodus 15:23. The hope that had been rising collapsed into frustration. The people grumbled against Moses and saying, "What are we supposed to drink?" Exodus 15:24. Moses didn't argue. He didn't answer in anger. The text says he cried out to the Lord, Exodus 15:25. God showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. Bitter turned drinkable. The impossible became provision. There the Lord gave them statutes and made a promise. "I am the Lord who heals you." Exodus 15:26. But the human heart forgets quickly. Not long after, in the wilderness of sin, a food began to run short. Exodus 16:1. A hungry stomach speaks loudly. The people grumbled again against Moses and Aaron. "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted." Exodus 16:3. A distorted memory is dangerous. They forgot the whips. They forgot the chains. They remembered only the meals. Freedom started to feel less valuable than the security of slavery. But Moses answered firmly, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord." Exodus 16:6-7. That evening, quail covered the camp. And in the morning, something fine, like flakes, lay on the ground. When the people saw it, they asked, "Manhu? What is it?" Exodus 16:15. Moses explained, "This is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." Each day they were to gather only what they needed, and nothing was to be kept until the next day, except in preparation for the Sabbath. It was daily provision, daily dependence. God was teaching constant trust. Still, some tried to keep more than they were told. Others went out on the Sabbath to look for food, even after clear instruction. Exodus 16:19-20, 27. Insecurity remained. Doubt kept whispering. They had seen the sea open. They had seen bitter water turn sweet. They had seen bread fall from heaven. And yet they still feared tomorrow. And they still grumbled. They still demanded proof. The body asks for bread, but the heart asks for a sign. The miracle feeds the body, but it doesn't change a rebellious heart. The journey continued through the wilderness of Rephidim, and once again there was no water for the people. Exodus 17:1. The scene felt familiar, but their hearts still hadn't learned. The thirst wasn't only physical, it was anxiety. It was fear of tomorrow. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses answered, pain in his voice, "Why are you quarreling with me? Why do you test the Lord?" Exodus 17:2. But the crowd was irritated, and some shouted, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst?" Exodus 17:3. The pressure rose. The leader felt crushed between the people's need and his responsibility before God. Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." Exodus 17:4. God answered with clear instructions. "Go on ahead of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." Exodus 17:5-6. The same staff that had touched the Nile would now touch a dry stone. Moses obeyed. In front of the elders, he lifted the staff and struck the rock. The sound echoed in the silence of the wilderness, and then water burst out, not a little, enough for everyone, while the hard rock became a fountain. That place was called Massah and Meribah because of the quarreling and because they tested the Lord. Exodus 17:7. That moment wasn't only about thirst, it was about putting God's presence on trial. The people were asking, "Is the Lord among us or not?" But before there could be any long rest, another challenge appeared. Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. Exodus 17:8. Now, it wasn't thirst, it was war. When Moses called Joshua and said, "Choose men for us and go out to fight Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." Exodus 17:9. On the hilltop, Moses raised his hands, gripping the staff. As long as his hands were raised, Israel prevailed. When he lowered them, Amalek prevailed. Exodus 17:11. The battle in the valley was tied to what was happening on the mountain. The wind blew hard, the sun burned. Moses' arms began to feel heavy, and the staff started to feel heavier than wood. It was responsibility. It was intercession. It was dependence. Aaron and Hur saw the strain. They came closer. They brought a stone so Moses could sit down. Then they stood one on each side, holding up his hands. Exodus 17:12. It wasn't shameful to admit weakness. It was wise to accept help. Aaron said, "You don't have to fight alone." Hur added, "As long as there's strength in us, your hands won't fall." And they stayed that way until sunset. Well, Joshua defeated Amalek with the sword. Exodus 17:13. The victory came not only through strategy, but through unity. After the battle, the Lord told Moses to write it down as a memorial. Exodus 17:14. Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." Exodus 17:15. The staff was not the banner. God himself was. The people won because there was cooperation. There was leadership. There was intercession. There was shared strength. But even after water from the rock and victory in war, as the human heart was still in process, they won through unity, but they will still fail. The staff won battles, but it can't defeat a rebellious heart. The external battles had been won, but another battle was beginning to show itself. Quiet, constant, exhausting. After the war against Amalek, the people continued their journey, and the demands did not decrease. Conflicts rose up every day. Arguments between families, disputes over property, questions about laws and decisions, and everyone kept coming to the same person, Moses. Jethro, priest of Midian and Moses' father-in-law, heard everything God had done for Israel and came out to meet him, bringing Zipporah and Moses' sons, Exodus 18:1-5. There was joy in the reunion. Moses told him in detail how the Lord had delivered the people from Egypt. Jethro rejoiced and declared, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods." Exodus 18:11. But the very next day, Jethro saw something that troubled him. Moses sat down to judge the people, and the people stood before him from morning until evening. Exodus 18:13. An endless line, weary faces, the same questions over and over, on hard decisions. Moses tried to listen to every case, explain God's statutes, and settle disputes. Jethro asked, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Exodus 18:14. Moses answered honestly, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, it comes to me, and I decide between one and another, and I make them know the statutes of God and His laws." Exodus 18:15-16. It was zeal, it was responsibility, but it was also far too much weight for one man. Jethro looked at his son-in-law with concern and spoke firmly. "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will certainly wear yourselves out. The task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone." Exodus 18:17-18. Moses, the man who had faced Pharaoh, now had to listen to counsel. Jethro instructed him to teach the people God's ways, but to appoint capable men who feared God, men of truth, men who hated dishonest gain, and set them as leaders over thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s. Exodus 18:19-21. Then only the hardest cases would come to Moses, and the smaller matters would be handled by others. That decision required humility. Moses could have answered with pride, "God speaks to me, speaks to... I don't need advice." But the text says something simple and powerful. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. Exodus 18:24. Leadership bleeds too. Fatigue doesn't care about titles. A calling does not erase human limits. Moses learned that sharing the weight is not weakness. It is wisdom. The people began to be organized. Justice became more efficient. The leader finally breathed. Maybe that night, as he sat alone, Moses reflected on the staff had been the instrument of miracles. But now the lesson was different. Not everything is solved with a sign. Some things are solved with structure, listening, and humility. The wilderness was teaching more than survival. It was shaping character. It was preparing the people for something greater. A revelation was drawing near. An encounter that would mark history. The greatest revelation is coming. But the people are not ready, are not. Even the chosen one can fall if he tries to carry everything alone. After the adjustments in leadership and the organization of the people, Israel arrived in the wilderness of Sinai. The text says plainly, "In the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that same day they came into the wilderness of Sinai." Exodus 19:1. There they camped in front of the mountain. This was not an ordinary stop. It was an appointed meeting. Moses went up the mountain, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, in saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself." Exodus 19:3-4. God did not begin with threats. He began with remembrance, deliverance before covenant. Then God declared, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. Oh, for all the earth is mine." Exodus 19:5. The people answered together, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." Exodus 19:8. The promise came quickly, but their hearts had not yet learned the weight of obedience. On the 3rd day, there were thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain. The sound of a trumpet was very loud, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Exodus 19:16. Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. When the smoke rose like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. Exodus 19:18. It was majesty. It was holiness. It was real presence. Then God spoke all these words, saying, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day was to keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet." Exodus 21-17. The law was not only rules, it was a revelation of character. It showed who God is and how his people were meant to live. But the impact was too great. The text says, "Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood far off." Exodus 20:18. And they said to Moses, "You speak with us, and we will hear. But do not let God speak with us, lest we die." Exodus 20:19. The same people who promised obedience now asked for distance. Holiness exposes human weakness. Moses answered, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin." Exodus 20:20. But the people stood far off. But while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was, Exodus 20:21. He went up alone. The leader entered the cloud. The mountain burned. the voice of the Lord thundered. Up there, God spoke about covenant, holiness, and presence. Down below, the people waited. While God was speaking on the mountain, something was beginning to form in the camp. The mountain trembles, and so does the human heart. While Moses remained on the mountain, wrapped in the cloud of God's presence, receiving the tablets of the testimony written by the very finger of the Lord, Exodus 31:18, time began to weigh on the people. Waiting exposed what was still hidden in their hearts. The text says, "When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron." Exodus 32:1. Impatience became a collective movement, and the crowd came close to Aaron and spoke dangerous words. "Get up, make us gods who will go before us, because as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." The leader's absence was enough to plant doubt. Their trust in God was still fragile. Aaron, under pressure, did not confront the sin. He said, "Take off the gold earrings that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." Exodus 32:2. The gold they had received when they left Egypt would now be used for idolatry. Aaron took the gold, melted it down, and shaped it into a calf. Exodus 32:4. When the people saw it, they declared, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." It was direct betrayal. It was trading invisible glory for an image shaped by human hands. Aaron even built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow will be a festival to the Lord." Exodus 32:5. They mixed idolatry with religious language. The next day, they offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. They sat down to eat and drink, and then they rose up to indulge themselves. Exodus 32:6. Worship turned into disorder. Up on the mountain, the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves." Exodus 32:7. God revealed what was happening. The covenant had been broken before Moses even came down. Moses descended the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, tablets written on both sides. Exodus 32:15. As he drew near the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing. The sight pierced him. The man who had spoken with God face to face was now watching his people celebrate an idol. Anger flared when he threw the tablets from his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. Exodus 32:19. The physical breaking of the tablets mirrored the spiritual breaking of the covenant. Moses took the calf, burned it in the fire, ground it into powder, scattered it on the water, and made the children of Israel drink it. Exodus 32:20. It was direct confrontation. Then he called Aaron and demanded, "What did this people do to you, or that you have brought such a great sin upon them?" Exodus 32:21. Aaron tried to justify himself. "Do not let the anger of my Lord burn hot. I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Exodus 32:22-24. But responsibility could not be erased. Moses stood at the entrance of the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." Exodus 32:26. The sons of Levi gathered around him. There was severe discipline that day. Exodus 32:28. Sin brought real consequences. And still, but Moses went back up to the Lord and interceded. "Oh, this people has committed a great sin. Now please forgive their sin. But if not, blot me out of the book you have written." Exodus 32:32. It was sacrificial love, a leader willing to pay a price for the people who had betrayed him. God answered that each person would answer for their own sin, but he promised that his angel would go before them. Exodus 32:33-34. The journey would continue, but the stain of betrayal would not be forgotten. And they had traded an invisible presence for something visible. They chose shaped gold over patient faith. If they idolized gold, what would they do with a famous leader? When the heart wants an idol, anything can become a god. After the shame of the golden calf and the discipline that followed, the people kept moving. On the outside, they were free. On the inside, they still carried the weight of restless hearts. The wilderness was not only a place of sand, it was a place where what is hidden comes to the surface. And it surfaced quickly. The book of Numbers opens by showing that complaining was not an isolated incident. It was constant. Now when the people complained, as it displeased the Lord, Numbers 11:1, they grumbled like people who no longer remembered what God had done. Complaint became routine. Gratitude disappeared. And when a heart gets used to complaining, nothing ever feels like enough. The fire of the Lord burned at the outskirts of the camp, and the people cried out to Moses. Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. Numbers 11:2. Again, Moses stood as a bridge. The people failed, and he interceded. But the pressure on him was enormous. Later, the crowd began craving meat, weeping at the entrances of their tents. "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish we ate in Egypt. But now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes." Numbers 11:4-6. It was as if manna, once a miracle, had become something they despised. Moses felt the weight and poured out his heart before God, and his words were blunt and painfully honest. "Why have you dealt so harshly with your servant? I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me." Numbers 11:14. It wasn't a lack of faith. It was human exhaustion. God answered in a practical way. He commanded that 70 elders be set apart to help Moses carry the load. Numbers 11:16-17. God did not ignore the leader's pain. He sustained him. But the greater test was still ahead. When the moment came to enter the promised land, Moses sent 12 spies to scout Canaan. Numbers 13. But the shock explodes in Numbers 14. They returned with fruit and confirmed the land was good. But 10 of them spread fear. "We cannot go up against those people, for they are stronger than we are." the core message of Numbers 13:31. Fear spread like fire. The people raised their voices and wept through the whole night, Numbers 14:1, as the words that came out of their mouths were a knife to Moses. If only we had died in Egypt, or in this wilderness, Numbers 14:2. And they went further. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? Numbers 14:3. The people even said, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Numbers 14:4. It was rebellion and fear together, not just insecurity, rejection of the promise. Or Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes and tried to wake them up. The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land. Only do not rebel against the Lord. Numbers 14:7-9. But the people wanted to stone them. Numbers 14:10. A hardened heart does not accept encouragement. It chooses fear. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting. God declared that He would strike the people down for their unbelief. And again, Moses stepped into the gap. He did not plead for himself. He pleaded for the people who accused him. Moses appealed to God's character. The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in love, forgiving sin and rebellion. Numbers 14:18. And he begged, "Please forgive the iniquity of this people, according to the greatness of your mercy." Numbers 14:19. God answered, "I have forgiven them as you asked." Numbers 14:20. There was forgiveness, but there was consequence. God declared the generation would not enter the land. They would wander 40 years in the wilderness until their bodies fell there. Numbers 14:28-33. The promise was not canceled, but it was postponed for their children. The people wept and later tried to go up on their own, but they failed because God was not with them in that act of presumption. Numbers 14:40-45. The wilderness would now be long, and each day would remind them of a hard truth. Freedom without inward transformation becomes nothing more than a journey with no destination. They were delivered, but not transformed. They came out of Egypt, but Egypt didn't come out of them. The wilderness continued. After the sentence of 40 years, the people kept moving, but inside the tension kept growing. A long journey wears people down, and exhaustion opens the door to hidden feelings, comparison, envy, bitterness. Moses was already carrying the weight of an entire nation. Still, there was something that hurt more than the people's complaints. It was when the wound came from close by, from within, from his own household. And the text says, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. Numbers 12:1. The criticism started with something that seemed small, almost an excuse. But it quickly became clear it wasn't really about the woman. It was about authority, about voice, about position. They said, "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us?" Numbers 12:2. It was the sentence of someone who feels overlooked, and at the words of someone who wants to divide what God has entrusted to another. And the text adds an important detail. The Lord heard it. God did not ignore it. God heard every word. Moses did not answer. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. And Scripture explains something that reveals his heart. Now Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. Numbers 12:3. That doesn't mean weakness. It means self-control. And it means a man who had learned not to fight for position. Moses had already been broken in the wilderness. He wasn't chasing fame. He only wanted to fulfill the calling. But God did not let it pass as though it were normal. Suddenly the Lord spoke. "Come out, you three, to the tent of meeting." Numbers 12:4. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam went. The presence of God came down in a pillar of cloud, and the Lord called Aaron and Miriam to step forward. Numbers 12:5. It was serious, and it was direct correction. God spoke clearly. "Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" Numbers 12:6-8. God wasn't saying Aaron and Miriam had no value. He was saying there were limits. There was order. There was reverence they had lost. As the text says, "And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed." Numbers 12:9. And when the cloud moved away, Miriam was leprous, white as snow. Numbers 12:10. Aaron panicked. He looked at his sister, then at Moses. His voice changed. This was no longer criticism. It was pleading. It was fear. Aaron said, "O my Lord, do not lay this sin on us, for we have done foolishly and have sinned. Please do not let her be as one dead, and whose flesh is half consumed when he comes out of his mother's womb." Numbers 12:11-12. It was a brutal scene. The same mouth that questioned Moses now begged him. And here is the point that reveals the heart of the leader. Moses could have stayed silent. He could have let the discipline run its course. After all, he had been wounded. He had been humiliated by those who should have supported him. But the text shows something else. Moses cried to the Lord, saying, "O God, please heal her." Numbers 12:13. A short prayer. Simple. No speech. No revenge. Only compassion. God answered that Miriam would be shut out of the camp for 7 days as discipline, and afterwards she would be brought back in. Numbers 12:14-15. And it happened exactly like that. So Miriam was shut out of the camp 7 days, and the people did not journey on until Miriam was brought in again. Numbers 12:15. The entire nation had to stop. The whole wilderness had to wait, and because a wound from within affects everyone. When she returned, the journey continued. But Moses carried an invisible scar. He had been attacked by people he loved. And still he answered with prayer. The leader bleeds, and yet he remains standing. Final hook. The leader bleeds, and yet he remains on his feet. The deepest pain isn't the one that comes from outside. It's the one that comes from someone you love. After Miriam returned to the camp, the journey began again. On the outside, it looked like everything would go back to normal. But on the inside, the people were still inflamed. God's discipline had happened in front of everyone, and yet many hearts remained restless. The wound within the family had proved something. Even those close to Moses could rise up against him. And that opened a dangerous door. Others began to think, if they questioned him, why shouldn't we? It was in that atmosphere that the most organized, most daring revolt against Moses' leadership took shape. The text says that Korah, son of Izhar, of the tribe of Levi, rose up with Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, son of Peleth, of the tribe of Reuben. And they gathered against Moses with 250 men, leaders of the congregation, men of renown. Numbers 16, 1-2. This wasn't a small group of complainers. These were known leaders and influential men. The rebellion came with force, with numbers, and with loud voices. They assembled in front of Moses and Aaron and said, without fear, "You have gone too far. All the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" Numbers 16:3. It sounded noble, but it hid poison. They used a truth to justify an error. Yes, God was among his people. But that did not mean anyone could take the place God had established. When Moses heard it, he didn't answer with shouting. The text says, when Moses heard it, he fell on his face. Numbers 16:4. He didn't react with pride. He went to the ground because he knew this wasn't merely human. It was spiritual. It was an attack on God's calling. Then Moses spoke to Korah and to all his company. In the morning the Lord will show who belongs to him and who is holy, and he will bring him near to himself. Numbers 16:5. He proposed a test, simple but serious. Each man would take his censer, put fire and incense in it, and present himself before the Lord. God himself would show whom he had chosen. Moses said firmly, "Do this. Take censers, Korah, and all your company." Numbers 16:6. Next, Moses exposed the real heart of the problem. Is it too small a thing for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do the service of the tabernacle of the Lord? And are you seeking the priesthood also? Numbers 16:9-10. In other words, they already had a place. They already had honor. But they wanted more. This wasn't zeal, it was ambition. Moses sent for Dathan and Abiram, but they refused. "We will not come up." Numbers 16:12. And they launched heavy accusations. Is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in this wilderness? You have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor given us an inheritance. Will you put out the eyes of these men, and we will not come up? Numbers 16:13-14. They called Egypt the land of slavery, a land flowing with milk and honey. That is what a rebellious heart does. It distorts reality. And they accused Moses as if he were a thief, a deceiver, and a tyrant. It was public shaming, a direct attack. Moses became very angry, but he did not move in revenge. He spoke to God, "Do not respect their offering. I have not taken even one donkey from them, nor have I wronged any of them." Numbers 16:15. It was like saying, "Lord, you know the truth. I did not abuse them. I did not steal. I did not exalt myself." Moses was wounded, but he placed himself before the right judge. Then came the moment of the test. Korah gathered the whole congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the censers were there. Numbers 16:19. The glory of the Lord appeared. God told Moses and Aaron to separate themselves, was because he would consume the people in a moment. Numbers 16:21. And again Moses and Aaron interceded. O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin? And will you be angry with all the congregation? Numbers 16:22. Even while being attacked, Moses pleaded for mercy. Then the command came. The people had to move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Numbers 16:24-26. Moses announced the sign. If those men died a common death, then the Lord had not sent him. But if the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them, everyone would know they had despised the Lord. Numbers 16:28-30. And it happened. The text says the ground split apart, opened its mouth, and swallowed Dathan and Abiram, their households, and everything that belonged to them. They went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed over them. Numbers 16:32-33. The people ran in terror, shouting, "Lest the earth swallow us also." Numbers 16:34. And the 250 men offering incense were consumed by fire that came out from the Lord. Numbers 16:35. The judgment was unmistakable. Heaven answered. The earth answered. But here is the most shocking part. The very next day, the whole congregation grumbled against Moses and Aaron, saying, "You have killed the people of the Lord." Numbers 16:41. Even after watching the earth open, they still accused. And a heart that chooses hatred will find a reason even when faced with the obvious. Then God sent a plague. Aaron ran with incense and stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. But 14,700 people died. Numbers 16:46-50. A terrible cost. A hard lesson. Moses stood again, not because he was strong in himself, but because God sustained him. Still, peace did not come. Not even judgment brought peace. The people remained difficult. The journey remained heavy. Not even judgment brings peace. When someone decides to hate, not even a miracle can convince them. The wilderness has a quiet way of demanding payment over time. One day looks like the next, but the years slip by like sand through your fingers. After so many revolts, so many corrections, and so many deaths, the generation that came out of Egypt was growing old on the road. The people kept walking, but they were no longer the same people who sang when the sea split open. Faces carried lines, souls carried fatigue, graves dotted the journey. And then came a loss that struck Moses like something deeply personal. Then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there, and was buried there. Numbers 21. The sister who watched him as a baby in the river, the sister who was corrected and later restored. Now she was gone. For Moses, it wasn't simply another death in the camp. It was the closing of a chapter of his own life. Grief in the wilderness has no luxury. There is little time to pause. And still, the pain weighs heavy. Moses' eyes must have searched for her face in the crowd out of habit, and then remembered. There will be no more. The silence of burial carries a kind of sorrow no one can fully explain. Moses had lost many people along the way, but some losses are different. Some have a name, a memory, a childhood attached to them. Aaron tried to come close, not knowing how to comfort him, and maybe he said, "My brother, she is in God's hands." Moses answered softly, almost without a voice, "I know, but it still hurts the same." And as if the wilderness respected no one's grief, the next problem arrived immediately. Now there was no water for the congregation. Numbers 22. Again. Another time, the same test, as if the people's hearts still needed to show what they truly were. The congregation gathered against Moses and against Aaron. But the word Scripture uses is strong. The people contended with Moses. Numbers 23. They didn't come asking. They came accusing. They came angry, almost as if Moses were responsible for the weather, the drought, the wilderness itself. They said, "If only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord." Numbers 23. And they continued, "Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place?" Numbers 24-5. It was a list of accusations. They called the place evil. They spoke of Egypt as if it had been better. They forgot everything again. Moses heard those words with a heart already heavy from grief. The pain of losing Miriam was still fresh, and now he had to face the fury of the people. The leader was not made of iron. He was tired. Tired of being blamed. Tired of being the target. Or tired of watching the same scene repeat itself. So Moses and Aaron did what they always did when things spun out of control. Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tent of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Numbers 26. They went to the right place, not to argue, not to prove anything, but to seek direction. And God spoke. The Lord's voice did not come in confusion, and it came with clear instruction. Take the staff and gather the assembly together, you and Aaron your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals. Numbers 28. So Moses took the staff from before the Lord, as the Lord commanded him. Numbers 29. That detail matters. The staff wasn't lying around anywhere. It was kept before the Lord, and it was as though God were saying, there is still a sign. There is still direction. There is still provision. And it was also as though God were bringing the staff back into the center of the story at the most critical moment. Moses held the staff. The wood that had seen the Nile turn to blood, that had seen the sea split, that had seen water burst from a rock before. It was there again. But the man holding it was not the same. He was older, more pressured, more wounded, and the wilderness was coming to an end for him in a way he did not yet understand. The people waited for water. God waited for obedience. And Moses stood between the two with a weary heart. The final test arrives, not with a sword, but with thirst. The wilderness doesn't end without revealing what's inside the heart. Moses stood before the people with the staff in his hand. Thirst was tightening its grip. The crowd was pressing in, and the Lord had already given the exact instruction. Take the staff and speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Numbers 28. He wasn't supposed to strike it. He was supposed to speak. God wanted the miracle to come through the word, so everyone would see it wasn't human force, and it wasn't an act of anger. It was simple obedience. As Moses took the staff from before the Lord, just as he was commanded. Numbers 29. That detail shows everything was still under God's control. The staff had been kept, the symbol had been preserved. But the leader's heart was exhausted. He had buried Miriam. He had endured accusations for decades. He had watched rebellions, deaths, and plagues. And now, again, thirst and complaining. The wilderness seemed to repeat the same test until it finally broke the man on the inside. Was Moses and Aaron gathered the people in front of the rock. And then Moses spoke. But he did not speak the way God had commanded. He spoke in anger, like a man who had reached his limit. Listen now, you rebels. Shall we bring water for you out of this rock? Numbers 20:10. The sentence is hard. It isn't only a rebuke. It is as if Moses, for a brief moment, places himself and Aaron at the center of the miracle. Shall we bring? Pressure twisted his words. Weariness twisted his spirit. When then he did what he was not meant to do. Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff. Numbers 20:11. Twice. Not once. Twice. As if anger itself was striking along with him. As if he wanted to silence the people through force. As if that moment became more release than obedience. And still, abundant water came out, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. Numbers 20:11. The people saw the miracle and quenched their thirst, but heaven saw the disobedience. And what comes next is the part that shakes you, because it reveals something many people do not want to accept. God takes the holiness of His name very seriously, especially in those who represent Him before the people. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." Numbers 20:12. The consequence was spoken right there and in front of the rock. The promised land, the dream of a lifetime, would be seen, but not stepped into. Moses, who faced Pharaoh, who saw the sea split, who climbed Sinai, who interceded again and again, would not enter. From that point on, something changes in the text. The staff, so present in the signs, begins to fade from the spotlight, not because it lost value as an object, but because God would not allow His people to turn a sign into an idol. Little by little, the center becomes obedience, but character, the holiness of the Lord's name. And the silence around the staff begins to grow, like a warning. Don't cling to the wood, cling to God. Time passes. The journey continues, and the end of Moses' life arrives. The book of Deuteronomy says Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, and the Lord showed him all the land. Deuteronomy 34:1. God let him see it, as if saying, the promise is real, but also as if reminding him, my word is serious. After that, the text declares, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there, in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord." Deuteronomy 34:5. And then comes a detail that sounds small, yet carries a mystery that reaches across centuries. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab. But no one knows his burial place to this day. Deuteronomy 34:6. God Himself buried Moses, not Joshua, not Aaron, not the people, God. And no one knew the location, no grave to visit, no relic to honor, no holy site to turn into worship, no doorway into idolatry. And this is where the title meets its most terrifying answer. Centuries later, a short letter near the end of the Bible reveals a line almost no one expects. In the book of Jude, verse 9, it says there was a spiritual dispute. But Michael the archangel, when he disputed with the devil and argued about the body of Moses, did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." That sentence is short, but it is explosive. It opens a window into the unseen. Satan tried to involve himself with Moses' body. He wanted that body for a reason. And Michael, an archangel, entered into dispute, not out of pride, not as a personal fight, but under the authority and order of God. And the final revelation is this, stated simply and faithful to the sense of the text. Satan wanted to turn Moses' body into an instrument of idolatry and accusation. On idolatry, because the people had already shown how quickly they could make idols. They shaped a golden calf in just a few days. If they had a tomb of Moses, a holy place, a body to venerate, the risk of worshiping the messenger would have been enormous. And accusation, because Satan is called the accuser. He tries to use failures as weapons of condemnation. And Moses, though a faithful servant, carried a mark, disobedience at the rock. The enemy wanted to use that to confuse, to shame, and to destroy the people's faith, pulling them away from the holiness of God. But God did not allow it. God guarded the body. God hid the grave. God protected his people from turning a man into an altar. Because the holiness of the Lord is greater than the fame of any leader. And true faith does not depend on remains, on objects, or on places. It depends on the living God. The answer is terrifying because it shows that spiritual warfare continues even after death. And it shows that God, and in mercy and protection, cuts off the path to idolatry before it can be born. The body wasn't hidden by accident. It was protected so you would never worship the messenger instead of the God who sent him. It all began with a simple question asked in the silence of the wilderness. God looked at a broken man, tired of running, and said, "What is that in your hand?" Exodus 4:2. Moses answered, "A staff." It was only wood. It was ordinary. It was what any shepherd carried. But when God chooses to use something, even the simplest thing becomes a sign. The lesson is direct. God does not depend on what looks impressive. He takes what is small and shows that power does not come from the object. It comes from Him. And throughout this story, suffering was not a side note. Suffering was a tool. Moses did not become a leader because he was strong. He became a leader because he was broken, tested, and matured. The wilderness stripped away pride. Pursuit stripped away impatience. Pressure exposed the limit. God shapes leaders in pain, not in comfort. So when you are going through hard seasons, don't assume God has abandoned you. Sometimes He is preparing you, the way He prepared Moses, for something greater than you can see. And betrayal, yes, betrayal came from every direction. It came from the people who complained. It came from leaders who rebelled. It even came from family when Miriam and Aaron questioned Moses. That teaches a hard truth. Being called by God does not mean you will be applauded by everyone. Sometimes a calling comes with loneliness. But betrayal does not cancel purpose. Moses bled on the inside, and he still kept going. And that speaks to many people who are tired, wounded, and disappointed by others. God does not call you to depend on human approval. He calls you to depend on Him. The miracles, on the other hand, were real. The staff became a serpent. The sea opened. The rock gave water. Manna fell from heaven. But there is a lesson many people do not like to hear. A miracle does not replace obedience. For Moses saw God's glory in ways few ever have. But when he disobeyed at the rock, God declared the consequence. Because you did not believe me, to uphold me as holy, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land. Numbers 20:12. God is good, but God is holy. And holiness is not negotiable. Here is a warning for life. The greatest danger is idolizing the instrument. The people had a tendency to turn anything into an idol. They made a golden calf in only a few days. And that is why God did something shocking at the end. He himself buried Moses, and no one knew the place. And he buried him, but no one knows his burial place to this day. Deuteronomy 34:6. God cut off the path to idolatry. God protected the people from worshiping the messenger instead of the Creator. And then, to show that this was even more serious than we imagine, Scripture reveals there was a spiritual dispute over the body, and Michael the archangel, that when he disputed with the devil and argued about the body of Moses, said, "The Lord rebuke you." Jude 1:9. That confirms God was guarding more than a grave. God was guarding the people's faith. God was protecting the holiness of his name. So the final truth is simple and deep. The power was never in the staff. The power was never in the body. The power was always in God. And that changes everything because it means you do not need a special object for God to act. That you do not need a perfect place for God to hear you. You do not need proof all the time to believe. If God is the center, everything else becomes secondary. Final conclusion. The secret is not about wood. It is not about a grave. It is not about a dispute. It is about holiness. And God protects what carries his name. If this story spoke to your heart, another video will appear on your screen now with Moses, who also went through testing, falling, and restoration, and discovered that God is still God, even when the road feels long and hard. Click it, subscribe to the channel, and leave your like. It truly helps us continue. May the God who called Moses in the wilderness, opened the sea, sustained him along the way, and protected even what no one could see, speak to you as well. Because sometimes God isn't silent because he's absent. Sometimes silence is protection. And the greatest revelation comes when we learn not to worship the sign, but the God who gives the sign.